Welcome back. So we got the brand new Arcane announced, or we got it announced 2 weeks ago when the Tempest Trials was happening, or maybe it was a bit more than that or a bit less, but regardless, we knew it was going to be an Arcane Axe, and we knew exactly what the contents of it will be, and now we know when it's coming out. And as a result, I figured it would be important to at least discuss some ideas for synergy purposes when it comes to this Inheritable Axe, because I know a lot of people are probably going to be pulling for it. And just like with the other previous 2 videos, we're going to be going over some builds and some notable candidates. And at the end of the video, I compiled a list of units that you probably would want to replace your innate weapon with for Arcane, as well as some that fall in between, as well as others that you probably just don't want to. And yeah, we're basically going to be doing the same thing as last time. So we may as well just get right into it. Arcane Downfall, to maybe no one's surprise, is another slaying Inheritable Arcane that grants Spectrum 5. But rather than a guaranteed follow-up, it has follow-up denial, it grants special cooldown +1 per attack, and it restores 7 HP every time the unit attacks. So even if they do 0 damage, they'll always restore 7 HP. This is going to be really strong for player phase purposes, mainly when it comes to Gale Force synergy, as it does have slaying on top of accelerated cooldown per attack, meaning that you don't have to give up a slot for Flashing Blade, or in some scenarios, Heavy Blade, where it's even much more difficult, especially for Cavalry and Flyers, as they are locked to that skill. And the attack set just continues to go up and up, meaning that Heavy Blade checks are just going to be a lot more difficult. But because it's unconditional per attack, you don't even have to worry about making any sort of Heavy Blade or Flashing Blade check, meaning that stuff like Gale Force is going to be really easy. Of course, you could still use this in the enemy phase with the likes of any sort of armor or even infantry, but even with that being the case, I find that you're probably going to have a lot more value with it in the player phase. Even so, there are things you can do with it in both phases, and I'll go over that in a second. But before I do, I want to talk about 4 units that you probably don't want to give it to at this time, mainly because they are slotted for refines. And that's Edelgard, Garrick, Ross, and Echidna. They're all book 3 units, and there's no telling when they're going to get a refine. They can literally get a refine anywhere between next month and maybe 5-6 months from now. And at that point, you may as well just wait. It's not like a crazy amount of time comparatively to a lot of other units that maybe could have used the Arcane Sword, for example. But when it comes to these 4 units in particular, they all have varying effects that can easily change in their refine. So Edelgard already has a slaying guaranteed follow-up weapon, which is already pretty good on its own. But again, it's due for a refine. It can definitely use a refine. Garrick, on the other hand, while it could always be Fire Sweep locked, there's no guarantee that it will, as we saw with Cynthia, who had a Fire Sweep Lance and didn't get anything Fire Sweep related. As for Ross and Echidna, Ross has a Brave Axe, and there's a good chance they're just going to make that a dual-phase Brave weapon, which will already be way stronger than the Arcane, unless they butcher it in some way, but I highly doubt they will, especially since he has a really high attack stat. And then with Echidna, there's no telling what they can really do with it. It's basically just 7 defense in the enemy phase. They can make it a fully enemy phase centric weapon, but again, there's no telling what they can do with it. And there's no telling when any of these units are going to get refined, so in my opinion, you really should just wait. Still, if you do want to inherit it to any sort of fast infantry unit, for example, you can do a lot of sets with it, because this weapon heavily favors faster units, mainly because it doesn't have a guaranteed follow-up built into it. So for example, one of the first things you can do with the Arcane Axe is run a Godlike Reflexes set, which can actually be really good, not only because it has innate slaying, but because it also has accelerated cooldown per attack unconditionally, meaning that you don't have to run any sort of breath support or Flashing Blade or Heavy Blade, and you can always just have it active immediately. So if you wanted to do something standard, you could always just do Shield Pulse with Finish and Oath, and then no follow-up seal, and they should be able to act really well in the enemy phase as a melee specialist. However, if you don't want to give up your B slot for Shield Pulse, you don't necessarily have to, mainly because it does have innate slaying. However, I do recommend that you run this with Quick and Pulse support, whether that's Asker for Light Season, Grand Scratcher for any sort of healer you want to bring, or even Infantry Pulse. And depending on the unit you put this on, it may be easier than others. Some units, especially older ones, have an absurd amount of HP. But if it's not really an issue, you could always replace the B slot for something like Bulwark and then stack supports behind them really easily and get even more sustainability out of it. Beyond that, you can do any sort of Gale Force strategy, whether that's for hit and run purposes or one-tap Gale Force with Wings of Mercy beaconing. So for example, Dagger makes a really good candidate for this, mainly because she already comes with even Tempest, but also she is a light mythic, meaning that she doesn't really have an opportunity cost to be ran. And while you will have to give up her PRF beat, you could always just run no follow-up into Sacred Seal, and it's not that big of a deal after that point. Besides that, you could just run Close Call or hit and run, and then run away with easily up to 3 or 4 movement, depending on the turn you initiate. Still, if that's not your cup of tea, you could always just go in with any sort of Wings of Mercy beaconing strategy, one tap with Arcane Downfall and Time's Pulse and Quicken Pulse, and Gale Force off that. Of course, there's also the possibility that you'd have to watch out for any sort of guard effect, but more often than not, I wouldn't really have to worry about it unless it's from a save unit. Beyond that, you could also do any sort of area of effect special spamming, which can actually be really good, especially for looping purposes. The slaying with the accelerated cooldown per hit means that you don't even have to worry about running heavy or flashing blade, or worry about running into guard, as you'll always be able to loop it. Unless there's tempo guard, which is very niche currently, but for what it's worth, you can still run double life and death with special spiral and time spell, so you can consistently loop Arcane Downfall. Atlas in particular has some of the highest attack in the game for an infantry unit, which is really convenient, and you should be able to shred through a lot of stuff that has speed-based damage reduction. Of course, if you are worried about stuff like Dragon Wall, you could always run Stillwater 4 and Fury 3, and you could potentially refine Arcane Downfall for res, or you could just go with the attack refine, which is probably going to be more consistent. But if you do want to worry about speed and res, you could always go double Fury. However, I do think Stillwater could easily make or break a lot of situations when it comes to Dragon Ball users. Of course, you could also just use this for any sort of instant special retaliation, whether that's with a 3 cooldown special or a 4 cooldown special. Running a 3 cooldown special means you don't necessarily have to worry about consistently getting damage out, as you can always retaliate with a bonfire or any sort of 3 cooldown special. And then with the likes of just stacking attack and speed, you should be able to hit really hard in general, and Bulwark will just keep your sustainability relatively high. Although you could also go for something that hits a lot harder, and this could mainly be for teching Brave Seliph, and while the color matchup isn't really that great, if you are able to retaliate with an instant Dragon Fang, then there's a good chance that you're just going to be reducing his HP to 1, and then you should be able to kill on the second hit, which can be really good. Although the only caveat with this is that if you do have to enter more than one combat, Dragon Fang won't really go off until the second hit, which is fine on its own, but you will still have to worry about specific matchups if it doesn't go in the way you were hoping it to. Of course, you could also do some sort of godlike reflexes thing at home, mainly just Pavis and Escuthin. I can never pronounce that, and I'll probably never be able to pronounce that. But nevertheless, if you don't have godlike reflexes, you could always just run Pavis, which works relatively fine as is. You're basically going to be doing the same thing with Finish and Joint Drive Attack and all that stuff, but because you could run a 2 cooldown variant, you can instead run Time's Pulse and then run Bulwark for even more tanking prowess, which can be really good. And while you're not necessarily getting as much damage reduction, you're healing a lot more, meaning that your sustainability is just going to be a lot higher. And beyond that, you could just use this for any sort of Dancer unit. I believe Performing Arts Azure is the only one that really qualifies for this, but even with that being the case, you're going to be doing the same thing as you were with the second Knot set. Wings of Mercy Beacon Chaining, one-tap Gale Force, or even double Savage Blow, if you're confident enough that you can charge Gale Force in that single combat. But if you don't, Time's Pulse with Quick Impulse should secure it pretty well, especially against squishier foes that you could probably one-shot. Still, you're going to be doing the same thing with Gale Force. And then you can dance, and after that, it's pretty good. And that's really about it when it comes to fast infantry builds. Next, we have the slow infantry builds, which is definitely going to be a bit more limited, mainly because it doesn't have a guaranteed follow-up built into it. But still, you could run stuff like Quick Riposte 4 with Arcane Downfall and no follow-up, meaning that the only way the foe will be able to double you is if they have no follow-up, or any sort of no follow-up effect, which really is only going to be common from the likes of maybe Brave Seliph, but that's already a bad matchup as is. Of course, there's other options like flows and all that stuff, but it's not going to be nearly as common. Still, with Quick Riposte 4, wasn't in the builder by the way, so I put Quick Riposte 3, but you could get Quick Riposte 4 and Arcane Downfall at the same time, run no follow-up, you could double and then retaliate with a bonfire in the second hit, which will do pretty significant damage, and you should be able to heal back whatever damage you take because Arcane Downfall heals per hit. And if you just want to do something that just hits a lot harder, you could do something like Ignis with Time's Pulse instead, and rather than running no follow-up in the Sacred Seal, I figured Deflect Melee could be a better alternative, mainly if you were to go up against units with Brave Attacks, which could always be a thing in the future, but there's no guarantee for it right now. But the idea is just that you soak whatever melee hits come your way, you retaliate, and then you hit with an Ignis, which should do a considerable amount of damage. And outside of that, you can really just do any sort of defensive stacking or sustainability builds, whether that's just by stacking defense and res as much as possible and then running quick riposte, or running a bulwark set and then defense res unity and all that stuff. And you're going to want quick riposte somewhere in your kit. Quick riposte in your B slot with quick riposte 4 is probably going to be a bit better, mainly because it also provides damage reduction. And then you could always use your Sacred Seal to boost even more stats. But there are a good amount of competitive B slots. But still, quick riposte 4 is really, really good. And if you would rather run that instead of something like low attack defense or attack defense bulwark, you can always run attack defense form or defense res form or whatever the case may be. Outside of that, you have the fast cavalry builds, and this is really going to be for Gale Force purposes. I find that with this weapon in particular, you're not really going to be doing much for the cavalry outside of just Gale Force, which they could still do really, really well because they don't have to run Heavy Blade. Rather, they could just continue to stack up speed so they can naturally double, and then they could either run Trace to hit and run, which can be really, really strong, or they can run a Flow so they can secure their own doubles. Although the former could always be used with no follow-up support, whether that's from Fallen Lilith or whatever no follow-up support you could grant, or even any sort of guaranteed follow-up, but I'll get into that in a bit. Regardless, you could either go with a guaranteed Gale Force set where if you were to run Quick Impulse and you were able to double and the foe were able to counter back, then you're always going to get Gale Force going because you're always getting cooldown per hit. But if you would rather have some sort of hit and run prowess and run away, Trace is going to be a lot better. Beyond that, you could honestly run an AoE set with cavalry units. However, I find that this is really going to benefit more if you either have Valoria or Spring Sonia. The latter being a lot better in my opinion, mainly because it is a button and you can just use that whenever you want, especially in more competitive modes like Summoner Duels, which can be really, really good. So for example, if you wanted to use Frederick with Life and Death, Trace, and Attack, Defense, Menace, and Quick Impulse. If you were to use Sonya support, then he could have Blazing Wind whenever you want, and then you can initiate combat, deal a load of damage, and then run away, which could be really, really good. However, if you want to do something a bit more gimmicky, or even make him a bit more physically tanky, you could give him Solid Ground, which still buffs your attack significantly, and you could run Defense Res Smoke, so you could actually set up Pathfinder, which could be really, really cool. But regardless, you're going to be using this for AoE sets, and I don't think you'd really want it for much else because slow cavalry and slow flyers don't really have a lot of options when it comes to the enemy phase. Beyond that, you can still do the same thing with fast flyers as you were with cavalry, but rather than running any sort of open C slot, you could run Tempest, which is going to be a lot better for just hit and run purposes, and I think that's where they're going to shine a lot more, mainly because they don't have any terrain restrictions, which is really, really strong. So whether you run Odd Tempest or Even Tempest and then Hit and Run or Near Trace, you're going to be able to do a good amount of damage, and then you should be able to run away after that point, which is really convenient. Although you could also do the same thing you did with Performing Arts Azura in the form of a Gale Force hybrid, or any sort of Wings of Mercy beacon chaining, whether that's with infantry speed tactics support, so you can actually provide no follow-up to infantry allies, and then you can provide any sort of no follow-up additional effects, maybe from Fallen Lilith, to other units that can't get it naturally, or you could do the same thing as you were with Combative Gale Force and with Quick Impulse, as long as they're able to double and the foe is able to counter back and they don't kill Azura, she'll be able to get Gale Force off, which is really good. And then finally, you have the armor builds, which again is really going to be for Gale Force purposes. Again, I find that you're really just going to be using this weapon for Gale Force in the player phase. But regardless, Amelia is definitely one of the better candidates in my opinion, mainly because she already has a really good offensive stat line on top of a Resplendent boosting her stats. And with the likes of Daring Fighter, she can actually confirm her own doubles as long as she's able to make the speed check. And while Daring Fighter isn't exactly a popular skill or a well-liked skill per se, part of it probably being due to the fact that it's locked on Winter Marth, this can actually work really, really well and doesn't overlap with Bold Fighter and will secure your own doubles. Especially against units maybe with Hardy Fighter and any sort of follow-up prevention in their weapon or wherever the case might be. With Daring Fighter, you'll be able to secure your own doubles, and you could Gale Force and run away after that point with Assault Troop, which will be really, really convenient. Of course, you could also do a 4-movement hit and run strategy, as with Gale Force and hit and run, you would be giving up any sort of ability to double unless you have no follow-up support or the foe doesn't have any sort of follow-up prevention. But if you're able to get this off, you can use hit and run and then Assault Troop your way out of there and just run away with extra security. Beyond that, you can do any sort of Wings of Mercy chaining. We've seen with a lot of other builds, but I think with armors in particular, I think it could be really, really cool. Mainly because if they are able to get Gale Force off and you aren't able to clear the entire team or have any sort of safety, then you can protect your allies with near save, which can be really, really good. And the reason we want armor boots here in particular, unless you have armor march support, is because you're not going to be able to move a lot after that point, especially if you are able to get Gale Force off. But in the second build, you could always use something like Armor Stride with Quicken Pulse, and as long as she's able to double in all those other conditions, depending on whether or not you go up against specific foes, she'll be able to move 2 spaces and Gale Force for a second time. And outside of that, you can basically just run any sort of far save or near save support. Doesn't really matter which. The weapon does wonders with Hardy Fighter, mainly because the only way they're going to be able to double any unit, such as maybe Momori, is through no follow-up. And if they don't have no follow-up, they're just going to be tanking a lot of the time. And because they have accelerated cooldown per hit in their weapon, they can reliably charge up Havis or Aegis consistently without the need of breath support or breath in their Sacred Seal, which means you can continue to stack up stats or damage reduction or whatever the case may be, which is really, really good. And this is a general idea when it comes to builds, when it comes to just using the Arcane Axe. And what's the Arcane Axe without any sort of support options? Whether that's visible no follow-up from a Fallen Lilith, which you can provide to any unit, which is really convenient. Infantry no follow-up, which you can provide to any sort of infantry ally, and you don't necessarily need Fallen Lilith, but you can also run both, and then you can provide no follow-up to many more units, especially if they are lacking no follow-up in particular. Or you could just run any sort of guaranteed follow-up support, whether that's from Naga, or the recently announced OG Harden, who provides guaranteed follow-ups to cavalry allies at the start of the turn, which is really good. And regardless of which one you have, there's a lot of flexibility in mind when it comes to it. So just keep this in mind when you want to use any sort of Arcane Axe unit with any sort of support for Gale Force compositions, as having a no follow-up effect is going to be important for securing doubles. And before we close off this video, I just wanted to briefly touch upon the options when it comes to just replacing their innate weapons for the Arcane Axe. I generally got a lot of questions about whether or not some units should use it, other units should not, but also it felt dragged out at some points, mainly because I would always talk about how, oh, this unit should keep it because this reason, and this unit should keep it because this reason. So I'm basically just going to do a roundabout, quicker way, especially if you don't want to watch or listen the entire way through. This is who I think you should give it to if you are looking to give it to somebody. A majority of them obviously fall in the replaced weapon category, mainly because a lot of them either don't have a good weapon or their refund is completely outdated. So for example, you could give it to maybe someone like Sheena, and they should be able to perform really well as a near or far save. But again, you could also give it to Garrick, Ross, Edelgard, and I know I said at the beginning that you may want to wait, but if you are impatient and you'd rather just gamble it, I think they could use it pretty well. But outside of just the replace weapon category, I do want to briefly touch upon can go either way and don't replace weapon. The can go either way, I think you can make the case for one way or the other, hence either way. So if you wanted to use this for maybe like Hector or Walhart, for example, Hector will definitely gain some benefits from using Arcane Axe, where he could also gain some benefits from using Berserk Armads, but it really wholly depends on what your play style is. You do get a good amount of healing from Berserk if you are able to launch a special, but you're also able to hit really, really hard in general from it, so it's wholly debatable as to whether or not you really want to give it to them, unless you're going to be using it for maybe near or far save purposes, in which case it can be pretty good. And Walhart, while he does have his flash gimmick, which is really, really good, you could also replace it and give him the AoE set, especially if you were to pair him up with Spring Sonya support, as she is able to grant the Quicken Pulse 2 effect to him, because Tharja is the backup. Outside of that, you also have stuff like Hilda and Annette, which can be used for supportive purposes. Edelgard, who does lose out on Raging Storm, but if you are using it for enemy phase purposes, then you definitely want to get rid of it. Hel, who I do think has a good PRF currently, but if you wanted to use them for something on Aether's defense, you're not really missing out on their C slot, because it's really just an Omni Rain, and that's pretty much whatever in the grand scheme of things. And beyond that, there's really just Shez. Shez does have a similar weapon in the vein that they do get accelerated cooldown per attack, but they also have damage reduction on the foe's first attack, which can be really good for sustainability purposes, where you do lack it from the Arcane Axe, but you are losing out on slaying and innate healing per attack, which could also make up for the deficit of damage reduction. So even with that being said, you can go either way with any of these. I think you can make a good case for each and every one of them, but when it comes to the don't replace weapon, I find that you're just better off keeping their PRF, not only because some of the effects are just way better than Arcane, but the other part of it just because they can't really function comparatively if they replace their weapon. So for example, Pirate Veronica has her guaranteed follow-up shtick, but she's extremely min-maxed. And if you don't have any sort of guaranteed follow-up support, then it's not really going to matter in the grand scheme of things because she's not going to be able to double. And that's basically her whole thing outside of just eating a hit and just dealing a lot of damage. Of course, you also have the likes of Brave Edelgard, who's just obnoxiously dumb with her refund. She gets healing, slaying, a lot of stats in guard. So I don't necessarily think you want to replace it because I feel like the downsides are way more than the upsides. You also have dual phase Brave users in the form of Ninja Levitain, Har, Summer Dimitri. I think dual phase Brave is just a lot stronger, mainly because you're not fighting any sort of speed check. You're always going to be able to double no matter what. And for specific units, maybe like Summer Dimitri, who has Atrocity, you're going to be giving up a lot of damage. And even though you could potentially make the case for potentially speed stacking for some of them, maybe like Lex, I find that you're just better off stacking up your attack, defense, and res at that point, because even if you miss the kill, you can still take a hit when needed. And Levitain doesn't really have good speed as is, so you're not really going to be missing out on the Arcane anyway. You have Larce, who has her Tempo, no follow-up slaying effect, which is really, really good. Thor, who has World Breaker. Spring Maria, who has her true damage reduction, which is really strong. Gustav with the guaranteed follow-up. Roy with Faith in Humanity. Ascended Fjorm with her Nifl's Bite, which is a really good weapon for Farsight purposes. Gustav, who's already a really, really solid tank with his weapon, and so on and so forth. I find that all of these units in the don't replace weapon category are going to function a lot better with their innate weapon rather than the Arcane. But you could always make the case one way or the other. And overall, that's really about it when it comes to the Arcane Axe. I know this banner isn't exactly the most exciting to a lot of people. You know, we have 2 demote staves, we have Ganglot. Harden's cool, and I know a lot of people don't really care for Tiki, or maybe they aren't exactly happy, or maybe a lot of people do care for Tiki. Still, I don't think it's one of the more desirable banners that we've gotten recently, and I don't know if you're necessarily going to be pulling for it, but if you are pulling for it, let me know for who. I'm going to assume Ganglot, but if you do pull for this axe, let me know who you're going to give it to, because I am curious. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.